your grandpappy's Robin Hood. We are talking The Siege of Robin Hood, an Australian movie directed, co-written and starring Paul Allica. And it actually mixes up a variety of kind of medieval fantasy kind of genres. Obviously the primary one being Robin Hood, but it mixes up characters from Arthurian legends, plus a kind of a few made up and possibly Viking characters and stuff as well. In a kind of a long movie. It's a 2-hour film. And who is this movie for? This is the question I'm going to be asking in this review. Who was this made for? But before we get into that, let me give you a brief plot synopsis. So it primarily focuses, as I say, on Robin Hood, who is kind of in the beginning of his kind of career as a, you know, robbing the rich, giving to the poor, etc. And the Sheriff of Nottingham and his kind of men decide he's going to kill Robin Hood, but they only can find his sister and end up killing her. So this sets up Robin Hood on a tale of revenge, and he kind of gathers up his merry men that includes Sir Lancelot, yep, and to try and storm the castle to get revenge on the Sheriff of Nottingham. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So this is an odd movie, really. It's kind of like, I can't really figure out who this is for, because the tone of this is very light, very, very light. It feels like it should have been a kids' TV series, but it has got kind of like some quite savage kills in it, albeit they're not, a lot of them are off screen, but for example, we get one scene where one of the bad guys bludgeons a woman, like an innocent woman, in the head until she's dead. And you know, we don't see necessarily the graphic detail, but we know that it's happening. So it's kind of like, is this for kids or isn't it? It's weird. It's a weird kind of like mix of tones. We'll talk about it in a little bit further detail. What can I say that works in this movie's favour? Now I will say I think the choreography in this movie is fairly strong, with a little asterisk by it, as long as you're not expecting kind of realistic battles for this kind of, you know, this time period where it's meant to be kind of taking place, or even the kind of the right continent necessarily, because as I say, this is a an Australian movie about an English legend, but it kind of features lots of kind of martial arts, which is obviously a kind of a, you know, Chinese kind of or Japanese kind of style of fighting primarily in this movie. So the kind of the fight scenes, albeit I think they're quite well choreographed, seem a lot more kind of like, you know, out of place. It kind of, if you've ever watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you know, every single kind of vampire seems to know kind of kung fu, and they even made a kind of joke about it. It's kind of like in here as well. It's like the majority of kind of fight scenes here are kind of kung fu style-esque, you know, quick pace, kind of fast edits, and you know, it looks good, but it seems out of place. But you know, it is well choreographed. I will say that, but obviously you have to kind of watch it with that kind of eyes. I mean, it's a fantasy movie, so I guess, you know, in some ways you can't be too precious necessarily. And I do think also the stunt work is reasonable here as well. So certainly in regards to kind of like action quota, if you don't mind it being maybe not the most realistic, and again we're going to come on to that, for its kind of time, and just want kind of like lots of kind of like high velocity action, then, you know, as I say, there's that. I think obviously this being an Australian movie primarily, even though obviously it's kind of not in the correct foliage and stuff, I do think these wide open spaces kind of do lend itself to some, you know, some good kind of like location kind of shooting and things like that. We get kind of a lot of kind of outdoor photography, and the movie's relatively kind of well made on a kind of a technical level. I'll kind of give it that with a little asterisk because there's some horrible ADR in here. But for the most part, the camera work, kind of the shot composition is kind of well done. A little bit glossy, maybe a little bit too glossy. Some of the edit transitions, for example, are a little bit kind of like contemporary, should we just say. So this is what I mean. All these kind of things adds up to a kind of a movie that is kind of aimed at kind of a more of a younger audience here, and even some of the way the kind of the characters are portrayed and acted seem like a younger audience, but I'm talking quite young. You know, I appreciate some of the kind of like the costumes. I like the fact that we have there's a jousting tournament here, which I thought was quite fun. So I kind of liked some of the kind of the aspects in this movie. I wonder if this was kind of filmed on at least partially, in some type of medieval theme attraction, because it seems like, you know, we get these kind of castles, but they're clearly kind of obviously somewhat contemporary, because we see like metal, you know, grates in the kind of the walls and things like this, and, you know, brickwork and stuff. They're not too worried about having the illusion of this is a realistic kind of you know, medieval style kind of castle architecture, everything like that. It's just kind of like, yeah, it kind of looks vaguely castle like, that'll do. So yeah, there you go. So I think if you have children, or you are a young person who you don't mind necessarily, this is quite a little bit more violent than maybe a movie primarily made for kids, then maybe this is one to watch. But let's transition into what does not work. Okay, so let's pull this thing apart. Okay, so if this movie is made for kids, it's way too long. It's way too long. This is a 2-hour film for a story with quite a scant plot. Let me put it like this. I had to watch this in 2 sittings because it was kind of hard to get through, I won't lie. It didn't need to be 2 hours long. In actual fact, I think this would have been better had it been maybe a series, a web series or something like that. I think he's shorter, kind of more digestible chunks. If it was made for a younger audience with maybe you know, an attention span which is minimal, I think it could have been a little bit more kind of consumable, kind of like that. But as it stands, it's a 2-hour movie. You know, it's very kind of candy floss and, you know, goofy kind of characters and things like this, with a kind of a long-ass running time. It seems counterproductive. But let's talk about that tone back again, because this, to me, again, it doesn't. I think this movie has somewhat of an identity problem. It almost feels like it shouldn't have been a Robin Hood. It could have just been a kind of fantasy movie, because it you know, it kind of out and out kind of misses out kind of characters and certain things of the Robin Hood legend, and then substitutes them with other things. For example, we have Robin Hood, we have Friar Tuck, but he's not a friar. He is kind of like a hipster blacksmith who's kind of a martial arts expert. We've got Little John. Little John, I suppose, is the most kind of like the legend, but we don't have Maid Marian. Instead, we've got a kind of a warrior woman who is initially a barmaid, but she just happens to be a warrior woman as well, called Frida, who's kind of like got this Viking kind of thing kind of going on. And then, as I say, they're joined by Lancelot from the King Arthur kind of legend. We also have Merlin in here. We even kind of see the Sword and the Stone, and have mention of Camelot and things like this. So we have this kind of like, it isn't really kind of anything to do with Robin Hood. You know, we've got the Sheriff of Nottingham, but he ends up becoming king. He's got his henchman bad guy, who is not Guy of Gisborne. So it's just that why even have Robin Hood if it's so kind of loosely connected? Why not just make it a fantasy film or a kind of medieval fantasy kind of like, you know, film? I don't understand why have Robin Hood if it's only going to have the bare bones of any type of connection there. It seems an odd choice. Obviously, Robin Hood is a name that exists in the public domain. Maybe they just want that kind of that recognition, really, that brand kind of like recognition. But it seems like an odd choice, and people will compare it to the Robin Hood legend unfavourably. The acting is very goofy. It's very kind of childlike acting, very kind of like silly, kind of like cartoonish characters that don't really have any real depth. You know, for example, we don't have Maid Marian in this movie. We have this other female character called Frida, and we're meant to believe that there's this kind of like love story between Robin Hood and her. But you know, in one scene, Robin Hood's kind of being, oh, well, why does a woman want to join our kind of gang and things like that? And then literally a couple of minutes later in another scene, they're kind of like, oh, you know, this is true love. I'm thinking, what? Come on. You know, it's just not built to kind of be any type of realistic connections, or even if you can suspend your suspension of disbelief, it doesn't really feel like you can kind of buy into the characters. Everyone seems very, very surfacey, very kind of shallow and just caricatures rather than real characters. Even, you know, Robin Hood's loss of his sister, you know, if you didn't want to have Maid Marian in it, maybe kill off Maid Marian, and that would, at least we have that name recognition where we can kind of buy into his motivations and stuff. But we don't really see them kind of together at all, really, to be honest with you. So we don't really, you know, there's not much of a kind of when she's killed, we've barely sort of seen them, so there's not a lot of you know, emotional depth to it. We just have to, oh yeah, he had a sister, you know. Everything looks kind of like too bright, too cartoonish, too kind of garish. The acting is terrible. The ADR is, you know, is one of the most distracting kind of like jobs of ADR here I think I've seen. It feels like the voices are kind of floating overhead, and it's kind of quite horrible. And yeah, it's just way too long, 2 hours. This movie, you know, to have been I think a movie aimed for kind of like a younger audience, it needed to be about 75 minutes. You know, it didn't need to be 2 hours. Even an hour and a half, I think, would have been pushing it. This movie needed to be 75 minutes and then have a punchy kind of like movie. But obviously, then you've got these kind of like slightly kind of gory deaths and kind of more brutal deaths in it. There's lots of kind of CGI blood and stuff, but the implication is kind of there. Obviously, there's cold-blooded killings and people getting their heads bashed in and stuff. So, yeah, it's kind of a little bit of an odd choice. If you don't mind a bit of violence for your youngsters, then I would suggest maybe you put it on. But I can't imagine them wanting to sit through it because, you know, it's like I've said, it's just so surfacey and kind of cartoonish. But maybe some would like it. But as a film for an adult, this is a very kind of like vapid and surface level, candy-coloured kind of Robin Hood movie that, as I say, has some technical elements that I appreciated. But I think as a story, as a narrative, the characters are weak, the acting is weak, the story is kind of like just a hodgepodge of ideas. It's a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.